Thank you for having me here. My name is Nilda Valmores, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director of My Sister's House. We're a nonprofit organization which for 15 years has been addressing the issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking with an Asian Pacific Islander focus. We're the only such nonprofit organization in the Central Valley. I'm just going to get to the point since our time is running short. I want to echo a lot of what Stephanie just said in terms of making sure that there's a broad focus on human trafficking victims and especially those of foreign-born victims. I just want to call some examples to your mind. I was going to share you some stories, but in the interest of time, I won't. So one of them is that of internet brides. So think of folks going on the internet to find a bride from a foreign-born country and bringing them over here. You may not know the local brothels in your community, but I would venture that probably someone from law enforcement does, or obviously some regular citizens do. I'm sure you get a lot of citizen complaints about the spas, the massage spas that have seemed to pop up all over throughout California. And finally, there's the notion of arranged marriages. Some of them are wonderful, many of them are wonderful, but then there are a few where they're not so wonderful, where the partners have purposely brought someone over to abuse them fraudulently. And people don't want to talk about if young people don't want to be labeled as traffic victims, definitely older women and older Asian women especially don't want to be labeled as trafficked victims. In fact, I've been calling some of what happens with Southeast Asian women as human trafficking because of the whole second marriages, the cultural marriages, and bringing over young women with a huge age discrepancy, many of them minors, and that the Hmong community isn't prepared to call it human trafficking yet. But we have to look at it as it fits the definition of force, fraud, and coercion. So definitely, one of my first recommendations is please, whatever you do, please remember the foreign-born victims. In California, with the high diversity that we have, it's not surprising that many of the Asian women that are largely trafficked end up in California. Secondly, want to talk about shelter, just as we've talked about housing, and just a reminder that the shelter model is going to be more expensive for traffic victims than a regular domestic violence shelter, in large part because of the security, also in part because of the trauma and the need for special services. Thirdly, law enforcement. You've talked a lot about law enforcement. Law enforcement's focus is on the perpetrator, as it should be. As service organizations, our focus is going to be on the victims. And so we're going to have a different language. We're going to have a different culture. We're going to dress differently to be able to try to restore the lives of these victims and to truly enable them to be success stories. And then also, one of the stories that I did want to share is that unfortunately sometimes law enforcement is involved as part of the problem. Sometimes they are the perpetrators. Thankfully, not all the time, but there is that situation that happens on occasion. Also, in terms of U visas and T visas, we've had many stories where it was a law enforcement that signed off on the case as was appropriate, and then still years later we're working with the client's papers, and what happens is that law enforcement officer has gone to another law enforcement agency or has retired, and so then there's a problem with getting that U visa or T visa application renewed, and so there's that issue, especially if there's no within that law enforcement agency. So it's really important that from law enforcement training to law enforcement working with a system for human trafficking victims, that there's more engagement, more involvement, more collaboration with the local service providers. So that's it in a quick nutshell for you.
Okay, and I'll mention that Nilda Valmores was an Assembly Fellow.
Yes.
So congratulations on going even much further. Certainly do talk to us, and I know that Ruth Silver-Taub is going to be discussing the UNT visas. To the extent that we are losing people who should get those visas, and you can address this as well, that is an issue, and if there's something we can do tell us that, because that is going to be very important, particularly in terms of being able to convict traffickers by being able to have those people here feeling secure and feeling that they can then testify. So the UNTs are clearly very important, and I know you're going to address that as well. So go ahead.
My name is Ruth Silver-Taub. I'm the Legal Services Chair of the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. I also supervise a workers' rights clinic at Santa Clara University School of Law, Catherine and George Alexander Community
So that's South
Center.
San Francisco Bay.
Yes, I'm also special counsel to Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center. And our clinic, 64% of the people who come to our clinic are either Spanish-speaking or Latino, but I also co-supervise a clinic for Vietnamese American clients. We have the largest Vietnamese American population outside of Vietnam, and also partner with the Filipino Bar to supervise a clinic for Filipino clients, because we see a lot of domestic workers that are trafficked, and we screen for trafficking in all of those clinics. I want to echo a lot of what's being said already. We do see labor and sex overlap, so often it's blended. You can't just say there's just labor and just sex. And I think I'm also coordinator of our wage theft coalition in our county. To me, labor trafficking is, and I think somebody touched on this earlier, there is a continuum to labor trafficking, because basically in virtually every labor trafficking case you have wage theft. Plus, and the plus is either physical or psychological coercion. And our class is one of the few who investigates retaliation cases for the Labor Commission, and we see a lot of that, those threats of being deported. I mean, we have cases where they've actually beaten people up, threatened to kill them, threatened to kill their family back home. We see that all the time. And so I think that's really, really important. And it's so frustrating to me to see movies like Taken or the visibility of commercial sex and sort of ignoring labor trafficking, looking at the continuum. And so I think that's really important. I also want to mention the debt comes up a lot, and we have people that are working off debts as well. I also see people who are forced to commit crimes. We have one now where he's now trafficked in a restaurant, but before that he was in a marijuana grow house. The trafficker hired an attorney, and he was forced to plead, and he has that on his record. So expungement is absolutely critical, so that's a huge problem. I want to talk a little bit about the approach of our coalition. We use a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach. We partner with law enforcement, and state and federal law enforcement get along with each other and work together, victim service providers, but we also have attorneys. You really need public benefit attorneys, and we have them. We have immigration, housing, and employment, and we often interview as a team so as not to re-traumatize the survivor by having them give multiple versions of what happened, maybe remembering something later, and it looks like it's inconsistent, but it really isn't. But also just having to relive that is very difficult. And we also work with them, and the Department of Labor is the only agency that certifies T visas. We really need to, the DLSC and the DFEH are very cognizant and do a lot about trafficking, but they only certify U visas. Same with the EOC. So that's really, really important that we have more Also encouraging civil labor trafficking cases because the survivor can get emotional distress damages. Also, attorney's fees deter traffickers. The survivor has more control and the burden of proof is less. And that may account for some of the discrepancies, I think, in numbers. I think some of them are certified through the DOL, or there might be some civil case because law enforcement isn't pursuing it. But it also has to do with different, the different ways that they're classified. We do have the one problem we are seeing with the district attorneys is that their definition of cooperation with law enforcement, which is what you need for the U or T visa, differs. And often with DAs, and I don't know if that's universal, but the ones we've been seeing, what they do is they say you have to go all the way through the trial. And often that can take a year. And if it's certified, if there's the sub B assigned, then you can get victim witness money. We have had ones that haven't been able to get dental work. The letter is enough to get public benefits, but in order to get work permits and temporary status, they have to have that signed. There's some law enforcement, the police, and some that'll sign it immediately when they report, and the DOL will do that too. So that's, I think, very important to have consistency. We also do training. The Super Bowl is coming to Santa Clara County, which really doesn't mean that there's more trafficking, but it does mean that there's more attention. We're getting more attention, and we're permitted to do training of public sector workers, and I've personally trained 1,500 public employees, including bus drivers and code enforcement, environmental health, and fire department. And I think it's very, very important to continue that training because they have the vision of trafficking, just like the movie Taken. They really suddenly realized that things that they'd been seeing all the time were in fact trafficking. We got 8 tips out of the bus drivers. Someone actually was able to detect something, called it in, and a child was able to get out of the situation. And code enforcement, because of our training, they are now bringing victim service providers. I want to say something about the training, and you mentioned that. It has to be culturally competent and linguistically competent, because we've had ice cream vendors, we've had hot dog vendors, we've had other cases where once it's detected, the only reason they want to cooperate is someone who speaks the language, is connecting with them, that they trust. And I know even with law enforcement, if we can vouch, we have one particular person that is victim-centered and trauma-informed, we can vouch for them as as legal service providers even. I've seen that in my clinic where someone was pursuing a civil case, and I said, yes, but they could get a T&U visa. They don't want to talk to law enforcement, but they do feel that, that they can trust us. So I think that's really, really important. And that the training outreach for labor should be targeted just like for sex, where they go to the fields, they go with a victim service provider, and they go to the restaurants, and they go to these establishments and do outreach there instead of just for sex trafficking. But as I said, it does have to be collaborative and culturally appropriate and targeted. Housing is a critical need, especially for men. We have a case right now where there's going to be a lot of people that we're going to have to serve, and we really don't have a place for them. So I think that's really, really important. The other thing is to get the DAs who are looking, unfortunately, they seem to be only funded, the economic crimes in many places, for workers' comp fraud. There are certain, like Alameda and Contra Costa, where the DAs are looking more broadly at other violations that they can bring on top of the trafficking. There's a bunch of them that are misrepresentation, underpayment of wages, failure to pay minimum wage. There are felonies like robbery, insurance, insurance fraud, things like that, and the trafficking too as well. And then they can get restitution. And restitution is critical because in civil cases, it's very difficult. We don't have the power as civil attorneys to freeze assets and to do what the DAs can do. So they need to be charging these cases as trafficking cases and maybe bringing all of these other claims as well, but also a trafficking as well. And also, even if they bring these cases, we need to see restitution in each case because it's powerful. It can get assistance to the trafficking survivor that you really can't get otherwise. And they have to work with lawyers to make sure that they don't calculate the restitution based on either federal wage and hour law, which really is terrible, and that they look at other claims as well. So finally, the collaborative approach of the South Bay Coalition is very effective. It aids law enforcement, victim service providers, and attorneys. Since the Super Bowl is coming, there's been increased awareness. We have now a regional group that had its genesis in the South Bay Coalition. It's called No Traffic Ahead, and it's involved in business training and creating tools to increase awareness. And I want to encourage more training. We're partnering with Office of Women's Policy. I think you can partner with various public agencies. And also, we're doing a lot of training in the private sector where we now have modules for restaurants. Stanford University is developing a MOOC for restaurants as well. And I have a Know the Red Flags. One of our clients who was trafficked is in that video and talks about what happened, and involving survivors is really important. And he said he didn't want to relive this, but he said, if I can stop this from happening to anybody else, then I'm willing. And he must have asked like 5 times when we were doing the video, are you sure it's going to help people? Because it was such a torment for him to go through, but it has really made a difference. So we're hoping to see training and education translate to increased awareness. I agree completely with the expungement problem, and also looking that the crimes that trafficking survivors are forced to commit are understood as such and not criminalized. Thank you.
Wow. So I'll just summarize. First of all, I would like the public safety staff, the 2 are here today. Gabe Caswell, thank you very much for getting these together. David as well. This has been a great hearing. And I would charge you with going through the testimony and coming up with legislation that we should look at, particularly in the area of assisting victims of human trafficking, looking at current training of law enforcement, talking about this concern with the U&T visas and how we get them, that we get the applications going in right away, and also in terms of, you mentioned recovery of assets for the people who've been trafficked. I think these are all critical. And then we've mentioned others, in particular, the importance of the wraparound social services. I will say this. Not all youth are trafficked, but all youth ought to have that same social service background. Even if they're not being trafficked, in my opinion, and I hope in the opinion of the legislatures we go forward, that to the extent that we can, and I need to talk with the DAs and the law enforcement, we can look at an approach as we have in Alameda County, and hopefully we can have across the state, where we look at treating these kids as kids and trying to get them on another path. And in some cases, like Deborah, they want to get on that path right away. Others may not, and how do we work on them as well? So I think that these are all critical items. I think that we have come up with a much more comprehensive view, and I would like, again, as we get the legislation together, and I don't have to carry it all because there'll be a huge burden, and to the extent, and of course Reggie Jones Sawyer is also the chair of the budget sub that deals with this, so he's going to have a key role as the chair of that committee. But Ms. Lopez, Ms. Santiago, Evan Lowe, who wasn't able to make it today, Senator Huff, to the extent that we can get this legislation forward, and I'd not only like us to come up with a package, not all of which we can probably get to this year, but then to bring it back to the members of these D.A. O'Malley and her colleagues and the various representatives we have here of agencies that are helping people, getting back to the academic research to see what we may have missed, what we may be looking at that's inappropriate. But I cannot tell you how much I've learned and how much I feel we can better look at this issue as not simply a law enforcement issue, but an issue involving the people who are the victims, helping them out, finding ways out, and then not only looking at criminal penalties, but again, where there's been wage theft, how do we make it easier for victims to get their due back? I think that is important, and I think that would be an important part of the process. So there is a lot to work on. Those are my comments. And Mr. Jones Sawyer?
And again, I'll make it brief because this hour's late. For me, what I would like to do is really focus in on the victims. And I say that because as I'm learning more and more about it, you have a young person at 11 or 10 years old that basically gets brainwashed into this. And even though it looks like when they hit 21, they may be willing participants, but they really are traumatized. They have the worst form of PTSD. And to send them to jail for something that they believe in their mind is the only way to make a living, the only way they can live, because they've been brainwashed, basically. We need to have an alternative. And I don't think we really have that in mass. So we're really talking about a mental health problem that we need to deal with. And I don't know if we have enough practitioners out there that's doing it. I don't know if there's enough resources. I don't know if we can have law enforcement just say we can have enough wraparound services that we can grab that person, bring them in, and then ultimately help them in a substantive way. And so that's why I've been looking forward to doing this. And as the chair of Budget Sub 5, more important, finding, as Mr. Quirk says, maybe a large portion of money or resources might be diverted to the human aspect of it and taking care of it. I have a way of looking at legislation that is probably very similar to what you do, and I tell people all the time, and as we move forward with this, Stephanie Richards, I have the 4 C's: communicate, cover, consequences, and costs. And so as a recovering bureaucrat, I tell people, go talk to the people who have to implement it, because a lot of times we here in the legislature, we create things, and then there's not enough money, or it's just a stupid idea, or it just doesn't make any sense. And then when we yell at the people who have to implement it, because they're saying, then you're the dumb ones, and we say, no, you're the dumb ones. And at the end of the day, the people who we're trying to help suffer. Try to cover everything possible so that we, as inclusive, so we don't have to come back and make up legislation. And then consequences. The unintended consequences of some of the things that we do are more harmful sometimes than the actual legislation. And then finally, for me, which we always seem to forget, is cost. And especially at a time where we're fortunate to have some money in the general fund, we should figure out what it will cost to actually implement it and make that part of the legislation, make that part of the budget request, and so that when we're going in, we're not underfunding things or not funding it at all, and then have it not happen. And so I have the same 4 C's in that order. And so I want to thank you. I want to thank all of you and everyone that's testified, because it has been illuminating. And I think we will have a very robust discussion come the fall. But I also think we're going to have a robust package of both legislation and funding opportunities coming in the fall.
Very good. Assemblymember Lopez.
Well, I just want to thank you all for all the incredible job that you do, and I applaud you all your effort, and I look forward to put some legislation this year and support your effort. And in my part, I try to focus on prevention programs and host some public hearings in my district that will benefit a lot in my community. So thank you so much for sharing all your great experience and your testimony that will benefit us. Thank you so much.
All right. With that, thank you very much, panelists. We'll then go to public comment. Who would like to make a public comment today? Could I have a raise of hands? See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So if I could give you each 2 minutes. And so just come forward. You can line up by that microphone that the sergeant is setting up right now. And I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Hi, I'll make this brief. My name is Franklin Nolan of Livermore. Just want to compliment everyone on their efforts. Come from a very intelligent community. Everyone's working very hard on finding solutions. Like you mentioned, a lot of things you can cause more problems by activating them. Costs are there, and we're now in the future. There needs to be ways of promoting these U and T visas, and we have ways. I mean, I can give you all the answers and write all the bills and activate it myself, but I'm not an elected official yet.
Well, just send us something in writing.
The visa pathway, find an alternative route to activate people in the community and generate tax funds at the same time of finding a green card / visa is going to be a real solution rather than letting people live in the dark. You focus people into a corner, they're going to strike back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Mike Chase. I'm on the board of directors of the Northern California affiliate of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. But I want to make it clear in this hearing, I am not officially representing the ACLU, but I'm speaking as a private citizen and a longtime human rights advocate. As I've listened to people speak today, there seems to be some understanding, and I'm glad to see it, of the fact that the conflation of sex trafficking of children and adults with sex work, which involves only consenting adults, has the effect of denying both adults, those consenting adults, both sellers and buyers, their rights. I am hopeful that there is also an understanding that consenting adult sex workers can be among your best allies in the fight against sex trafficking. As this committee moves forward with new legislation to address trafficking, I would like to specifically address something that has come up today and that I would like to ask you to guard against. Sometimes we hear from people who begin with talking about trafficked children, but who then slip in a mention of adult sex workers who have a history of having been trafficked as children. The implication seems to be that these adult sex workers are somehow less than full adults and should not be believed when they say that they are now doing sex work as consenting adults. This approach to these consenting adult sex workers leads to egregious violations of their rights, and it is also an affront on their dignity as adults. So my specific request is that you guard against this kind of perception, a misperception, as you move forward with new legislation. Thank you.